What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Thanks so much for checking out today's video. Today we're going to be looking at another church from New York City. Today we'll be looking at Trinity Church, and this will function as kind of like a sister episode to the last video that we covered, which was on St. Paul's Chapel. So if you haven't seen that one yet, I would encourage you to check it out because the histories of these two are linked in a lot of different ways. But I'm going to do this one a little bit different. I'm just going to plug all of the footage that I have of the church right at the beginning, and then just come back after and talk about it, because it'll be kind of like a talky heavy episode with me nerding out about a lot of the history of this church. So if you're not interested in that, completely understand. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and show the footage now and then come back after and talk about it. All right, so to talk about the church a little bit now. So as you could tell from the footage, I wasn't actually able to get inside of this church, and that's kind of part of the story. So that's this is the second time that I've visited Trinity Church, and both times. So the first time when I went last year, or I guess like a year and a half ago in 2024, I went during visiting hours, and then the church was closed for some kind of a special event or something that was going on. So at least that time the grounds were open around it, so like the famous graveyard, I was able to go in that, which was cool. And then this most recent time also went during visiting hours, and the church was closed for some kind of a private event. They were filming something, and so I don't know. So I'm going to keep trying. Every time I go to New York, I'm going to try to get inside this church because it's very, very famous. But because I wasn't able to, I mean, I couldn't do like a full coverage video, if you will. But there is a lot of really cool history with this church, so I figured that was worth talking about at least. Probably the most notable of this is some of the famous parishioners, of which, like, I put a picture of the grave of Alexander Hamilton in there. And we talked about with St. Paul's Chapel on the last week's episode that George Washington worshiped there. He also worshiped at this church, which I think is pretty cool. And this church. The history of this church goes way back, which I think is extremely cool. Like, it was established in 1697, and the very, very first version of the church, like the actual physical space, was built in 1698. So that is an extremely long time, extremely old church. And then we talked about last week how in the 1760s, because the population had boomed so much in that area, they built St. Paul's Chapel to kind of like help the congregation from having to travel as far. And I learned that St. Paul's is actually not the first one that was open. There's another chapel that's called St. George's Chapel that opened in the 1750s. So next time I go to New York, I'll try to see that one as well, because I haven't seen that church before. And then there's also, there were several others too. So this was really an expansive congregation that kind of continued to grow in this time. And then we mentioned last week, but during the Revolutionary Wars, war was breaking out in and around New York. The Great Fire of 1776 completely destroyed this church. So that was something that St. Paul's was able to endure, and that church was not destroyed, but the original Trinity Church building was. So then that's why St. Paul's had kind of such a notable history in that time while this church was being rebuilt. Like, the congregation was still able to meet at St. Paul's Chapel, which I think is cool. So the second church building opened in 1790. And George Washington, president at the time, while the Capitol was in New York, attended the consecration ceremony, which is cool. And it's also said that at that time, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay were notable parishioners. They both rented or owned pews at the time, which was kind of a custom, like for your family to have like a certain spot in the church. So I think that is extremely cool. So again, I said the second church building because this one, the current one, is actually I believe it's the third iteration of the building. There's so many dates that go along with this because it goes so far back. But in the 1840s, the second church building that we just discussed was having structural issues. So they rebuilt it to the church that it is now in the 1840s. And it's in that neo-Gothic architecture style. And the church was established in 1846, or it was consecrated in 1846 with this third building. And the steeple, 280 feet high, it was the tallest building in the United States. It says for 23 years, and the tallest building in New York City until 1890. So, I mean, that's pretty cool. And it definitely does, like when you stand right up under it, you get a feel for kind of how big the steeple is and just the church in general. So yeah, I mean, this building standing since 1846, I really like the architectural style from the outside. And if you're able to go at the very least kind of like through the graveyard, it's kind of cool that because it kind of like they cue you, like it basically goes all the way around the entire exterior of the church. So you get a feel for like all the different aspects of it, even from the outside, which is kind of cool. And you get that, like, I think kind of grand scale by, just by walking through there. So, if I'm ever able to get inside the church, I will do another video where we can look at it and talk about the some of the notable stuff from the interior. But why I think this church is really cool is, again, because of the parishioners. I mean, this church I think is famous in a big way because Hamilton is buried here. Obviously, he's a just like monumental historical figure in early U.S. history, but then also, I mean, becoming the Lin-Manuel Miranda's play Hamilton, or musical Hamilton, just becoming such a big phenomenon for what it is, and obviously like being on Broadway for so long and being very, very close to where this church is located, I think kind of builds the lore of some of that. And Trinity Church is actually name dropped in the very last song in the musical Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story, which I think is pretty cool. And that song also references that Angelica Church Schuyler, or Angelica Schuyler Church, which would have been Hamilton's sister-in-law, is also buried there, and they have plaques for a lot of these notable people that were buried there. Same with Hamilton's wife, Eliza, she's buried here, and their son, Philip, who famously died in a duel at the same place where Hamilton would later die, which is just absolutely crazy. He's buried there as well. And I mean, the list kind of continues. It's kind of crazy. So Hercules Mulligan, who's also a very prominent figure kind of in the early American Revolution times. He's also featured in the musical Hamilton. He is buried here as well. So even if you can't go inside the church, like going through and walking just through the grounds of the cemetery, I think is worth it. It's pretty amazing. And kind of some other notable figures. John Jay, he's a name that kind of, I think, gets lost, for some reason kind of gets lost to history, but he is like a monumental figure. In the early days, he was the first Chief Justice of the U.S., and during the Confederation Congress, he was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, which would become, as we know, Secretary of State, which that's a very important position. He was a big member of the Federalist Party. He helped write the Federalist Papers, which Hamilton became famous for. And he was a signer of the Treaty of Paris. He orchestrated the what's called the Jay Treaty with Great Britain during Washington's administration. So a lot of he's a monumental figure. So like I said, he was a notable parishioner. And then James Monroe, who was a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he would eventually become the 5th president of the U.S. He was a member at the church, and he had both his wedding and then ultimately his funeral was there. And there's so many others as well. But again, just notably, Hamilton, who, I mean, his history precedes him at this point, but I mean, he was just such a huge figure. He fought in the American Revolution. He was a major advocate for the Federalist Party, writing the bulk of the Federalist Papers. He would be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. And yeah, he was in Washington's administration as the first Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, the list goes on, but obviously his demise has become famous just for its absurdity. Dueling the sitting Vice President Aaron Burr and dying in that duel is just absolutely crazy. But it definitely caps just like such an incredible and just unpredictable life that he lived, coming from absolute obscurity. So I think it's very cool that he's buried here and is just buried so close to places that he impacted in so many different ways. His funeral was at Trinity Church here. And after he was shot, the rector of the church, who he knew, administered his last rites and was kind of there at his side when he died, which I think is very, very interesting. So yeah, I mean, there's just so much history wrapped up in this, which I think is worth talking about. And like I said, every time I'm in New York, I'm going to try to keep going back to this church so I can get inside of it, because I hear it's amazing. But the church being so old, I think just gives it such a, just like a vaulted status. And I definitely love just all of that history as it relates to the American Revolution, because I'm obsessed with early American history. So hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to have a couple more coming from New York City in the coming weeks, which I'm excited about. So thanks for tuning in and for letting me ramble about and nerding out about the history of this church. But thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back with another video on the channel soon. But until then, keep looking up.